Welcome to the Humanized Books channel. Today we have the most important wisdom, our health. Let's start to delve a little deeper into the topic I want to develop for you today, a story about how healing became an industry and how that industry began making people sicker. Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis has an enduring legacy because it does something very few books dare to do. It questions not just some medical practices, but the idea of modern medicine as an unquestioned good. Ivan was blacklisted in medical academia, they say too radical, too prophetic. Written in 1975, it offered a radical critique at a time when faith in scientific and institutional progress was extremely high. Illich argued that beyond a certain point, medicine stops being purely helpful and becomes counterproductive. It harms patients through side effects and errors, but also harms society by creating dependence, redefining normal life as illness, and taking away people's ability to face pain, aging, and death with their own resources. His critique is radical, not because he hates doctors, but because he attacks the deeper assumption that every problem in life should be solved by experts in technology. Illich claimed that when medicine expands too far, it quietly weakens our capacity for autonomy, resilience, and mutual care. Today, debates about overdiagnosis, medicalization of everyday life, pharmaceutical power, health anxiety, and the limits of high-tech care all echo Illich's concerns. That is why Medical Nemesis still feels unsettling, relevant, and ahead of its time. It forces us to ask where healing ends and where institutional control begins. In 1975, Ivan Illich wrote Medical Nemesis as a warning. At the time, his ideas sounded extreme, even outrageous. He claimed that modern medicine, if allowed to expand without limits, would eventually harm the very people it was meant to protect. Not just through clinical mistakes, but through something deeper, a cultural shift where ordinary suffering becomes a technical failure, where people lose confidence in their own bodies, and where the medical system quietly replaces personal judgment, community wisdom, and the human art of care. Nearly 50 years later, Illich's warnings no longer sound radical. They sound familiar. Today, we live in a world where health has become a constant project. Apps track our sleep, watches monitor our heart rate, algorithms tell us when to breathe, and ordinary emotions are often reframed as disorders requiring intervention. The more medicine promises certainty, the more anxious and dependent society becomes. Illich predicted this shift long before smartphones, digital diagnostics, or global health crises. He argued that as medicine grows, it begins to shape how we understand ourselves. What counts as normal, what counts as risk, and what counts as suffering gradually becomes defined by institutions rather than individuals. The result is a culture that treats fragility as failure, a culture that forgets how to endure, interpret, and make meaning of its own experiences. This mini-book revisits Illich's ideas not as historical curiosities, but as tools for today. Whether you trust modern healthcare, critique it, or simply feel confused by its complexity, Illich offers something rare, a way to think clearly about the limits of medicine, the value of autonomy, and the importance of reclaiming our own capacity to live, suffer, and grow with dignity. His critique began in 1975. Its relevance belongs to us. Introduction. Ivan Illich was a cultural critic, historian, and philosopher whose work confronted the hidden costs of modern institutions. Trained as a priest and educated across multiple disciplines, Illich possessed a rare ability to observe society not from within its assumptions, but from a vantage point just outside them. His writing is rigorous, unsettling, and rooted in a deep concern for human autonomy. In Medical Nemesis, he argues that modern medicine, despite its achievements, has reached a point where it often harms the very people it claims to serve. Central to Illich's critique is the concept of iatrogenesis, harm caused by medical intervention. But for Illich, iatrogenesis is not merely clinical. It is social and cultural. Medicine can injure bodies through treatment, but it can also enter societies by redefining human experience, monopolizing care, and dissolving the individual's capacity to interpret and endure suffering. This mini-book explores those arguments, tracing Illich's claim that a mature society must balance professional medicine with cultural wisdom and personal agency. His critique is not a rejection of healing, but a call to recover the human skills, meanings, and forms of resilience that no institution can replace. Part 1. The Epidemic of Clinical Damage. Part 1 of Medical Nemesis establishes Illich's most provocative argument, that modern medicine, while conceived as a means to protect and restore health, has evolved into a system that often produces the very harms it claims to prevent. Illich calls these harms iatrogenic, injuries caused directly or indirectly by medical intervention. But for him, iatrogenesis is not merely a technical failure or a tragic exception. It is a structural, cultural, and epistemic phenomenon, a sign that society has surrendered the art of self-care to an institution that increasingly monopolizes suffering, defines normality, and manages human fragility as if it were a technical malfunction. For Illich, the mature human is someone capable of confronting suffering with understanding rather than dependence, someone who recognizes limits rather than outsourcing all agency to institutional authority. Part 1 explores how modern medicine undermines this maturity, generating not only physical harm but moral and cultural paralysis. To do that, this problem is every turfley. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Clinical iatrogenesis, when treatment becomes injury. Subtheme 1. The everyday presence of medical side effects. Illich describes clinical iatrogenesis as the most visible yet least philosophically examined form of medical harm. It includes the unintended consequences of drugs, surgeries, diagnostic procedures, and hospital environments. In Illich's view, these harms are not anomalies. They are woven into the fabric of high-technology medicine, a system that extends its reach faster than its ability to evaluate its own effects. He emphasizes that the modern patient is caught in a paradox. The more medicine promises to eliminate risk, the more vulnerable the patient becomes to new forms of injury. This is not due to malice, but to a structural hubris, a belief that technological escalation always equals improvement. Illich critiques this modern faith, arguing that the escalation of intervention multiplies points of failure. He notes that medical interventions often produce counter problems, where solving one issue generates new disorders that require further treatment. This creates a chain of dependency in which the individual's natural resilience becomes secondary to professional control. Subtheme 2. Errors as systemic phenomena. Illich's critique is not directed at individual practitioners. He insists that clinical harm arises from organizational scale, bureaucratic incentives, and cultural expectations. When medicine becomes an industry, harm becomes normalized. He does not sensationalize this, but states it plainly. A system built on throughput and technical supremacy inevitably produces casualties. The mature human response, Illich suggests, is not panic or mistrust, but clarity. The ability to see medicine as a tool with limits rather than a guarantor of safety. He warns that societies which demand risk-free life turn themselves into clients of an institution that cannot fulfill such expectations. Chapter 2. Social iatrogenesis, the erosion of autonomy. Subtheme 1. Medicine redefining suffering. Illich expands the concept of iatrogenesis to include social harm, the way medical institutions redefine what it means to be ill, well, or capable. As medicine grows in cultural authority, it begins to shape the meaning of discomfort, aging, vulnerability, and deviation. Experiences once considered part of ordinary human life are reclassified as medical conditions requiring intervention. This reclassification may appear compassionate, yet Illich argues it robs individuals of the capacity to interpret their own bodies and emotions. Maturity becomes medicalized into compliance. The citizen becomes a patient even in the absence of pathology, encouraged to interpret ordinary suffering as a technical problem. Subtheme 2. The professional monopoly on care. For Illich, medicine becomes socially iatrogenic when it monopolizes what used to be shared human competencies: caring for the sick, accompanying the dying, coping with pain, understanding the rhythms of the body, and cultivating endurance. When these capacities are externalized to specialists, society becomes dependent, fragile, and less capable of navigating uncertainty. He warns that when institutions replace communal and personal resilience, society loses not only skills, but meaning. Care becomes a service to purchase rather than a human bond. The mature person, Illich suggests, is someone who can participate in their own healing and understand suffering as part of life's fabric, not merely as a malfunction to be corrected. Chapter 3. Cultural iatrogenesis, the destruction of traditional health patterns. Subtheme 1. The loss of cultural tools for suffering. Illich's most profound critique emerges in cultural iatrogenesis. He argues that medicine does not merely cause harm through treatment or institutional dependency. It reshapes human culture by eroding the symbolic, communal, and existential frameworks through which societies have long interpreted suffering, aging, and death. Traditional cultures possessed rituals, stories, and shared practices that helped individuals integrate these experiences into a meaningful life. Modern medicine, by attempting to eliminate suffering entirely, dismisses these frameworks as outdated. Yet without them, suffering becomes intolerable. People lack the psychological and spiritual tools necessary to confront the limits of life. Illich does not glorify suffering, he clarifies it. For him, maturity requires the ability to confront life's unavoidable pains with dignity, intelligence, and solidarity. A culture that medicalizes every discomfort produces people unable to face their own humanity. Subtheme 2. The commodification of health. In Illich's view, modern medicine transforms health from a personal and communal achievement into a product delivered by experts. Health becomes something you receive rather than something you cultivate. This inversion leads to passivity. Individuals lose not only autonomy but responsibility for their own well-being. Maturity, in Illich's eyes, means reclaiming this responsibility, not by rejecting medicine, but by restoring balance between professional intervention and self-directed living. Chapter 4. Escalating medicalization and the illusion of progress. Subtheme 1. More intervention, more dependency. Illich closes Part 1 by showing how medical expansion, often celebrated as progress, paradoxically generates more fragility. Each new technology promises control, yet introduces new uncertainties. Each expansion of medical jurisdiction removes another realm of life from ordinary understanding. He argues that societies confuse technological sophistication with human development. But true maturity requires confronting limits, not attempting to abolish them. A society that loses its capacity to live with limits loses wisdom. Subtheme 2. The mature stance toward medicine. For Illich, the mature individual recognizes that medicine is valuable but not omnipotent. Technology can relieve suffering but cannot eliminate it. Institutional care can support life but cannot define its meaning. Autonomy and responsibility must never be surrendered wholesale to professionals. This stance is not anti-medical. It is anti-idolatry. Illich wants individuals to reclaim the right to interpret their bodies, to participate in their own care, and to face life's trials with inner resources rather than institutional dependency. Part 1 establishes the foundation. Medicine becomes a nemesis, not through intention, but through excess. When a tool becomes a worldview, it shapes people in ways that diminish their humanity. Part 2. The medicalization of life. In Part 2 of Medical Nemesis, Illich deepens his critique by showing how medicine, once a limited technical practice, has gradually extended its authority into nearly every aspect of human existence. What began as a system for treating disease now defines the boundaries of normality, dictates appropriate behavior, and manages the existential moments that once belonged to families, communities, and personal conscience. For Illich, the most disturbing development is not that medicine treats illness, but that it increasingly creates the categories through which individuals understand their bodies and experiences. The medical worldview becomes the interpretive framework for life itself, turning what was once human into something administrative. This encroachment, he argues, has a numbing effect on maturity. People lose the capacity to endure, interpret, and respond to life's challenges without institutional mediation. Chapter 5. The expropriation of health. Subtheme 1. From personal capacity to professional dependency. Illich begins by showing how health has shifted from a personal state of equilibrium to a commodity supplied by experts. Historically, health was understood as a dynamic balance, each person maintained through diet, physical labor, rest, communal practices, and an understanding of one's limits. But as medical institutions gained authority, health was reframed as something produced by professional intervention. This shift redefines the individual as fundamentally insufficient. The modern subject becomes someone who must be monitored, screened, and corrected. The body becomes an object requiring continuous oversight, while the person loses the confidence and competence to care for themselves. Illich argues that this dependency erodes dignity. Mature individuals must be capable of assessing their own condition, interpreting discomfort, and making decisions grounded in lived experience. When this capacity is expropriated, people become passive consumers of health services, incapable of acting without expert approval. Illich critiques the modern belief that health can be endlessly optimized. This ideology keeps the individual in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. There is always a metric to improve, a risk to manage, a deficit to correct. What might once have been accepted as the ordinary way of living is now interpreted as pathology. The promise of perpetual enhancement prevents acceptance of the body's natural cycles. Maturity, in Illich's view, requires acknowledging decline, limits, and mortality. The medicalization of health trains individuals to resist these truths, creating anxiety instead of wisdom. Chapter 6. The Medicalization of Social Problems. Subtheme 1. Turning social issues into medical conditions. Illich explores how medicine increasingly treats problems rooted in social injustice, economic inequality, or cultural conflict as individual medical disorders. Conditions shaped by poverty, alienation, overwork, or loneliness are reframed as biochemical imbalances or physiological malfunctions. This reframing obscures their true causes. Instead of addressing structural injustices, society pathologizes the individuals who suffer from them. Illich warns that this practice not only depoliticizes suffering, but isolates it. People become patients rather than citizens capable of collective action. Maturity, for Illich, involves recognizing when suffering is personal and when it is social, and responding with appropriate forms of solidarity rather than medical dependency. Subtheme 2. The therapeutic state. Illich identifies the emergence of a therapeutic state in which medicine is used to regulate behavior, maintain productivity, and reinforce norms. Deviations from socially approved conduct are interpreted as medical issues requiring intervention. In this framework, medicine becomes a tool of governance, shaping citizens according to institutional needs rather than human flourishing. This development carries a deep cultural cost. Individuals internalize the belief that their worth depends on professional validation. The mature human, however, must be capable of evaluating their own experience and resisting the pressure to conform when conformity undermines dignity. Chapter 7. The Medicalization of Death. Subtheme 1. The Loss of Personal and Communal Meaning. For Illich, one of the gravest consequences of medical expansion is the transformation of death from a family-centered, culturally meaningful event into a technocratic process managed by institutions. Death, once integrated into the rhythm of life, becomes a failure of treatment or a problem to be solved. This shift deprives individuals of the opportunity to face mortality with clarity and maturity. Illich argues that dying requires a form of wisdom that cannot be delegated. When institutions monopolize the final stages of life, they strip death of its existential significance. He does not romanticize suffering or deny the value of palliative care. Rather, he insists that the human confrontation with mortality is essential to the development of character. A society that hides death deprives individuals of one of life's most profound teachers. Subtheme 2. The Tyranny of Prolongation. Illich critiques the cultural expectation that life must be extended at all costs. This obsession with survival turns dying into a series of procedures, often performed without reflection on their meaning or consequences. In Illich's view, the mature stance toward death recognizes both the value of treatment and the necessity of acceptance. He insists that medicine must serve life, not cling to vitality at the expense of dignity. To die well, with lucidity, self-possession, and connection is a human right that modern systems often unintentionally erode. Chapter 8. From Cultural Disorientation to Human Maturity. Subtheme 1. The Collapse of Shared Frameworks. Modern societies, Illich argues, rely increasingly on institutions to define every aspect of human experience. This dependency creates cultural disorientation. People no longer inherit communal tools for interpreting illness, suffering, or death. They receive technical explanations that lack existential depth. Without these frameworks, individuals feel exposed and uncertain. They become not more free, but more dependent. The result is a population that has lost the capacity to face hardship without seeking institutional mediation. Subtheme 2. Recovering autonomy and meaning Illich does not call for the abolition of medicine, but for the recovery of proportion. He advocates a form of maturity grounded in personal agency, community engagement, and acceptance of life's limits. Individuals must reclaim the right to interpret their own bodies, to participate actively in healing, and to face mortality with wisdom rather than fear. This recovery does not require rejecting modern science. It requires resisting the impulse to hand over responsibility for every aspect of existence. A mature society allows institutions to serve life without dominating it. Subtheme 3. The philosophical ground of Illich's critique. Underlying Illich's argument is a profound respect for human potential. He believes individuals are capable of more resilience, understanding, and meaning-making than modern institutions acknowledge. The task is not to escape suffering entirely, but to integrate it into a life lived freely and consciously. Part 2 ends with a call to restore harmony between professional care and personal sovereignty. Without this balance, medicine becomes an agent of dependency rather than liberation. Part 3. Toward a Society Without Nemesis. In Part 3 of Medical Nemesis, Illich moves from diagnosis to prognosis. Having shown how medical institutions can harm individuals, communities, and cultures, he now explores what a society free from such institutional overreach might look like. This is not a utopian fantasy, nor an anti-medical polemic. Instead, Illich asks a philosophical question. What are the limits within which medicine can be beneficial without becoming destructive? A society without nemesis, without institutional self-destruction, would be one in which medical services exist but do not monopolize the understanding of health. It would acknowledge the value of technology while preserving the human capacity for suffering, decision, and responsibility. It would empower individuals rather than reduce them to clients. And, above all, it would remain conscious of the difference between the art of living and the science of repair. Chapter 9. The Epidemic Spread of Medical Counterproductivity. Subtheme 1. When systems undermine their own purpose. Illich argues that every major institution faces a threshold beyond which increasing its power produces diminishing returns. Beyond this threshold, the institution begins to sabotage its own mission. Medicine becomes counterproductive, not when it fails occasionally, but when its scale and logic transform health from a personal responsibility into a bureaucratic product. Illich treats counterproductivity as a systemic phenomenon. The more extensive medical services become, the more individuals are encouraged to interpret ordinary life conditions as pathological. Healthy people become patients in waiting. Risk becomes a condition requiring intervention. This effect is not trivial. It subtly restructures daily life. People become less tolerant of discomfort, less confident in their own resources, more inclined to seek medical confirmation for experiences where it's interpreted by personal insight or communal wisdom. Subtheme 2. The inflation of needs. One of Illich's deepest insights is that industrial systems create the needs they claim to satisfy. Medicine generates demands by redefining normality, expanding diagnostic categories, and promoting the expectation of constant optimization. Once individuals internalize these norms, they feel perpetually inadequate. The result is a culture in which maturity, the capacity to endure, reflect, and make decisions, is replaced by dependency. Illich stresses that this dependency is not accidental. It is embedded in institutional growth. Chapter 10. The Medical Monopoly on Health, Subtheme 1. The Disappearance of Lay Competence. Illich illustrates how societies lose their capacity for autonomous health as professional medicine expands. Competencies once widely shared, caring for illness, understanding bodily states, coping with uncertainty, gradually disappear. What was once embedded in ordinary life becomes the exclusive property of experts. He argues that this expropriation is both intellectual and emotional. As people lose confidence in interpreting their own states, they become psychologically dependent on external verification. Everyday sensations, moral decisions, and existential questions become matters for professional adjudication. This is not merely a loss of skill, It is a loss of identity. A mature individual, Illich insists, is someone who confronts their own body and experience with intelligence, courage, and humility. When these capacities are outsourced, personhood itself is diminished. Subtheme 2. The narrowing of permissible experience. As medicine becomes the arbiter of health, it narrows the range of acceptable human experience. Variations once considered part of natural diversity are classified as disorders. Responses to grief, fatigue, stress, or decline are standardized into protocols. This normative force transforms culture. Individuals become less capable of interpreting their lives through stories, traditions, or shared meaning, relying instead on a technical vocabulary that may describe symptoms but cannot illuminate their significance. Illich views this shift as a profound cultural loss. It removes depth from human experience, replacing wisdom with procedure. Chapter 11. The Decline of Ethical Self-Governance. Subtheme 1. Moral decisions replaced by technical procedures. Illich argues that institutional systems tend to replace ethical reflection with technical solutions. Questions that once required personal judgment, how to live, how to age, how to face death, become procedural matters. This proceduralization gives the illusion of certainty, but it eliminates the moral exercise through which individuals mature. For Illich, the ethical self is formed through confronting limits, making decisions under uncertainty, and accepting responsibility for the consequences. When institutions promise to remove uncertainty, they also remove the conditions for ethical growth. Subtheme 2. The erosion of communal responsibility. As medical institutions take over the functions of caring, decision-making, and interpreting suffering, communities lose their bonds. Networks of support. Family, neighbors, local norms. The result is a society in which individuals are isolated and dependent, lacking both agency and solidarity. Illich does not condemn professional care. He condemns monopoly. He insists that a healthy society requires a balance. Professional services should supplement, not replace, communal practices. Maturity, he insists, is inseparable from responsibility. When responsibility is transferred to institutions, individuals lose the opportunity to exercise and develop it. Chapter 12. Rediscovering the Art of Living. Subtheme 1. Health as a Personal and Cultural Practice. Illich concludes Part 3 by articulating what a society without nemesis would require, a recentering of the individual and community in the cultivation of health. This does not mean rejecting medicine, but restoring proportion. Individuals must reacquire the skills, interpretations, and rituals that allow them to confront suffering with dignity. Health becomes something lived rather than something delivered. Healthy societies, Illich argues, have room for Chi personal interpretation of bodily states, Chi communal support networks, non-technical responses to suffering, cultural narratives that give meaning to decline and death. Medicine is valuable only when it does not obscure these other sources of strength. Subtheme 2. The Limits of Professional Help. Illich insists that professionals are indispensable within their sphere, but destructive when they extend beyond it. A mature society knows where that boundary lies. It preserves the spaces where individuals and communities must act on their own behalf. This insistence on limits is central to Illich's philosophy. Without limit, institutions expand until they undermine the human capacities they are meant to support. Without limits, medicine becomes not a healer, but a hegemonic force. Subtheme 3. Freedom from Institutional Dependency. The final theme of Part 3 is liberation, not from medicine as a tool, but from medicine as a total worldview. Illich envisions a society in which individuals reclaim the right to interpret their own experience. Communities reclaim the responsibility to care, and culture reclaims the wisdom to guide people through life's inevitable trials. A society without nemesis is a society where medicine serves life without defining it. Part 4. The Limits of Medicine and the Recovery of Health. In Part 4, Illich turns from excavation to reconstruction. Having shown how medicine crosses thresholds that render it counterproductive, he explores what it means to recover the moral and cultural space in which health becomes a human achievement rather than a medical service. This part is quieter in tone, but more radical in its implications. Illich does not propose reforms. He proposes a reorientation of society's understanding of health, suffering, responsibility, and mutual care. Medicine is a powerful tool, but only culture, conscience, and community can restore health's deeper meaning. The path forward requires limits on institutions, and limits on the modern tendency to treat every discomfort as a technical fault requiring professional intervention. Part 4 stands as Illich's argument for a mature society, one capable of reclaiming agency without rejecting knowledge. Chapter 13. The Threshold of Counterproductivity. Subtheme 1. Recognizing Systemic Saturation. Illich begins this chapter by emphasizing that every institution has a threshold beyond which it cannot expand without undermining its own purpose. Medicine, he argues, long ago crossed that threshold. Once the basic clinical achievements were secured, antibiotics, anesthetics, emergency surgery, further escalation shifted from genuine medical progress to administrative and technological inflation. Beyond this point, additional complexity generates harm. More tests produce false positives. More interventions produce new conditions requiring treatment. The system begins to produce dependency rather than resilience. In Illich's words, a society that loses awareness of limits becomes iatrogenic at its core. Recognizing this threshold is the first step in regaining balance. Illich does not propose abandoning technology. He proposes learning to distinguish between what is genuinely therapeutic and what is merely institutional momentum. Subtheme 2. The Lure of Institutional Promises. Modern societies, Illich suggests, possess an almost theological faith in progress. Medicine becomes a secular religion, promising deliverance from pain, uncertainty, and mortality. But this promise when institutions fail to eliminate the conditions of life itself, they become destructive precisely because they cannot fulfill their promises. The mature stance is to acknowledge that institutions have limits and that many of life's fundamental questions lie outside their jurisdiction. Chapter 14. The Recovery of the Commons of Health. Subtheme 1. Health as a Shared Social Capacity. Illich argues that true health is a property of communities, not institutions. It emerges from patterns of mutual care, local knowledge, self-limitation, and shared responsibility. Historically, societies possessed a rich commons of health practices and rituals that allowed individuals to cope with illness, aging, and death with dignity. As medicine expanded, this commons eroded. What was once shared became professionalized. The ability to care shifted from families and communities to hospitals and clinics. Illich does not condemn this shift. Entirely professional medicine has saved countless lives, but he insists that without the communal dimension of health, societies become fragile. To recover health, communities must reclaim the capacity to support one another through the experiences that define human life. A mature society empowers its members to be participants in healing, not passive recipients of service. Subtheme 2. Health as Competence, not Consumption. Illich distinguishes between competence and consumption. Competence is the ability to interpret one's bodily signals, endure discomfort, make decisions under uncertainty, care for others, and accept limits. Consumption treats health as a product delivered by experts. The recovery of health requires restoring competence. This does not mean rejecting professional help. It means ensuring that professional help does not replace the individual's ability to act, reflect, and decide. A mature human being remains at the center of their own experience. Chapter 15. Redefining Suffering as a Human Experience. Subtheme 1. Suffering as an Existential Dimension. Illich approaches suffering with philosophical seriousness. He argues that suffering is not merely a technical problem to be solved, but a dimension of human life that carries meaning, prompts reflection, and fosters solidarity. When medicine attempts to eliminate suffering entirely, it strips individuals of the opportunity to integrate pain into the story of their lives. Illich is not advocating for glorifying pain. He is advocating for understanding. Suffering becomes intolerable not because it is hard, but because individuals lack the narratives and communal rituals that once helped them endure it. A mature society offers wisdom, not just analgesics. Subtheme 2. The Danger of Medicalized Meaninglessness. When suffering is treated only as malfunction, individuals lose the ability to respond to it creatively or spiritually. Pain becomes senseless unless relieved, and its presence is interpreted as an error rather than a call to reflect, adapt, or seek connection. Illich fears that this medicalization renders people existentially fragile. Deprived of meaning, suffering becomes terrifying. The task of a post-Nemesis society is to restore the cultural frameworks that allow individuals to confront suffering as part of a life lived fully and consciously. Chapter 16. Limits, the foundation of a humane medicine. Subtheme 1. Ethical and institutional limits. In this final chapter, Illich argues that limits are essential to both medicine and society. Without limits, institutions become oppressive by accident. Without limits, individuals lose the ability to grow. A humane medicine is one that acknowledges what it cannot do, heal every wound, eliminate every risk, or deliver immortality. This acknowledgement is not defeatist. It is the basis for wisdom. Limits create the space in which individuals and communities can exercise agency, cultivate resilience, and develop their own practices for meaning-making. Subtheme 2. Recentering human responsibility. Illich insists that recovering health depends on restoring personal and communal responsibility. Institutions can treat disease, but they cannot replace the work of living. They cannot substitute for friendship, love, courage, ritual, or reflection. They cannot carry the existential burden each individual must bear. A society without nemesis is one that invites individuals to grow into maturity, not by promising freedom from suffering, but by cultivating the inner and outer resources needed to face it. Subtheme 3. A vision for post-industrial health. Illich concludes with an invitation rather than a prescription. He imagines a society in which medicine serves life without colonizing it. Suffering is met with solidarity rather than technical escalation. Communities recover their capacity to care. Individuals reclaim the right to interpret their bodies. Technology is used with humility. Health becomes a shared competence rather than a product. Such a society is not anti-modern. It is post-nemesis free from the illusion that institutions can replace human maturity. In conclusion, Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis remains one of the most challenging critiques of modern society because it forces us to examine not only the limits of medicine, but the limits of our own expectations. Illich shows how the medical system, despite its achievements, becomes harmful when it exceeds its legitimate scope, when it redefines suffering as malfunction, transforms citizens into clients, and displaces the cultural, communal, and personal practices through which humans have always coped with fragility. His argument is not a rejection of medical care, but a reminder that health cannot be delivered the way machines deliver energy or goods. Health is rooted in responsibility, competence, solidarity, and meaning. When these elements are surrendered to institutions, individuals lose not only autonomy, but the opportunity to mature through the experiences that shape human life. The mature society Illich envisions is one that accepts limits, not as failures, but as conditions for wisdom. It is a society that protects the space where individuals can interpret their bodies, confront suffering, support one another, and integrate mortality into a meaningful existence. Medicine can treat disease. Only culture, conscience, and community can support a life lived with dignity. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy our summary based on inspiration to do something great in our life. I look forward to see you in next mini books. Don't forget to subscribe and like. This helps us reach more people, and comments are always welcome. All the best.